Questions? Dr. Joseph moves that we approve the minutes. Is that right, Kelly? Thank you. Do I hear a second? And that's Karen Lawless seconds the motion. Thank you very much. Moving to agenda item number 4, Amelia is prepared to present an update on the third grade paper-based versus computer-based testing for LEAP. Thank you, Amelia. We appreciate the work you've done here.
So as promised in our last meeting, we've brought forward some more information about the computer-based and paper-based testing decision that we need to make as we move forward with third grade. I wanted to just provide a little background information for the council today. And before I get deeper into some of the additional background information, I just wanted to briefly recount that we have previously made the decision as a department to move forward with computer-based testing all the way back in 2014. In 2015, we made the jump to 5 through 8 going forward with computer-based testing with a 1-year exemption. And since then, we've continued to move towards computer-based testing for all of 3 through 8. It was first originally anticipated that we would move to third grade computer-based testing in the upcoming school year. However, given some of the reporting that we've done and the realization of how many third graders are still doing paper-based, we've brought it to this council to discuss just to get your input on the item. So there isn't any further action that we are required to take after this meeting, but we did want to go ahead and hear from you as our stakeholders because we believe you'll provide some valuable feedback as we go forward in making a decision on when do we off-ramp third grade onto computer-based testing, or what does that process look like to make sure that all students in the state are adequately represented in that discussion. So one of the points that I wanted to bring forward today is just to share with you some of our data points from our legislative report that we shared around educational technology and our strategic goals. And so you'll notice that we have actually 4 total strategic goals, and we've included goal 1 and 4 here for you today to review. We believe that we've been making the steps necessary across the state to help support all students moving towards a place where they're either one-to-one or have direct access to the technology needed to continue in their education in the best way possible. We know it's the 21st century and everything is barreling towards being completely electronic. And so as we consider that and we continue to move forward as a state, we wanted to make sure that our goals are aligned with that. And so today I just wanted to make sure you also saw what those goals are and what some of our team members here at the department are working on supporting school districts towards. In addition, we had the fortune of providing emergency funding towards schools, specifically in ESSER dollars, and approximately $280 million of those dollars were specifically towards technology, hardware, internet access, et cetera. And so it is exciting that we're in a place where many programs are really working towards a one-to-one implementation, and that there is this ability for schools to have previously purchased this technology and to continue encouraging their students to have access to what they need as they move forward. And obviously, we're using this as we consider the implication of logistics as we move towards potentially computer-based testing in third grade as well. But this is just one of the pieces of consideration. Furthermore, we've encouraged increased broadband capacity, and we've made it a priority to expand it across the state. So we've adopted some broadband goals and device specifications to help support technology access for all students. This will mean that multiple grade levels can test at the same time without having to worry about connectivity issues. And so that leaves us at the end of our legislative report around technology and educational technology. I feel like we have seen a really steady progress towards where we need to be as a state in order to ensure all students have access to what they need for testing. In addition, this council specifically asked around, well, what about the mode study that was completed here at the department? And so I wanted to bring back some data points there as well. If you'll notice on the screen, 4 items out of the 63 items total showed very small differences between paper-based and computer-based testing. And what I think is actually very interesting is the 3 items that showed that they were slightly more difficult were actually on the paper-based test as compared to the computer-based test. And so for this reason, because there wasn't a significant difference, they were actually ultimately treated the same in scoring. So based on this study, we feel very confidently about moving forward in 3rd grade computer-based testing. In addition, we also promised this council that we would bring forward some additional examples of what computer-based items might look like and some of the technology that is available for students in testing. So these items are just mock-ups and not exactly what they'll look like in the platform, but some following examples will include drag and drop, a drop-down menu, hotspot, and text highlight.
I have a question.
Yes.
Have y'all determined yet the level of exposure to the skills and all that are needed for computer-based testing in the lower grades? You know, there was a while there where they were not being exposed and we were going to computer-based testing and the dragging and everything like that was a problem. But have y'all determined level of exposure?
We haven't exactly determined the level of exposure that is needed, but we have continued to build the items for technologically testing before the actual assessment, and actually they will be available for the social studies test here in the coming months. And so students will be able to log in and practice with the items so that teachers have access to understand what those skills are, and students have access to directly practice what does the drag and drop look like when I log into the testing platform.
The scoring with like the drag and drop in your example, is there double dip grading here? Because if they miss one, now they're going to miss 2, or is that counted as one object? I was just wanting to make sure we're not hitting them twice.
That is an excellent question. I'm actually not exactly sure how the scoring would work, but I'm happy to find an answer for you. And so on the screen, you have an example of what drag and drop would look like, where the students would match up specifically the pieces into the different actions. What this would look like on a paper-based test is most likely they would have a multiple choice question instead. And so this just gives them the opportunity to interact with the item more and gives us the opportunity to have something that is a little more engaging for their attention. This item is an example of a drop-down menu. It gives them a list of options and a select a choice, usually to complete a sentence or a paragraph that may have multiple drop-down menus with key terms or information.
And again,
Same question. Great, thank you. The text highlight allows students to choose from pre-identified portions of text, such as selecting phrases or sentences within an excerpt that support an idea or show a concept.
Would I know social studies were moving to a possible, where it's read out to them, text-to-speech feature. I know with this test, obviously, y'all are using social studies examples. Would this be considered then, if it's going to be online, would it be then definitely text-to-speech for social studies test with the, the pieces of the drag and response and all that? Like, how would that work? Would they be reading then all the selections to the kids, the response, you know what I mean? Just like you would for a text-to-speech student?
That's a great question. I'm not sure how the technology on the text-to-speech will work, and that study is obviously underway, but I'll make sure to get an answer for that as well.
And Angela, I think in the meeting in February, Thomas was talking about possible videos that could be seen. Is that correct, Thomas? And that, so more than text-to-speech about, they're not going to read what someone said, but they're going to hear what someone said in the actual video demonstration of it. So maybe an example of that would be good too.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have an example of what that video could look like at this time because we're still in the development of the assessment, but I'm hopeful that we'll have something here in the near future. So additionally requested by the council was an understanding of what we believe the process timeline could look like, and what we think the difference will be if we were to move to computer-based testing. Based on some very preliminary internal estimates, we believe that we could get the results roughly 10 days sooner. This is obviously dependent on several things, but I did want to go ahead and give you our best rough estimate at this time. As we close out this item and I finish up my slides for this information, like I said before, no further action is required from the council, but we are interested in hearing your input and feedback today as we consider the timeline and make plans as we move forward. So, thank you.
I have a question about the 5-week window for testing. Is it going to be closer to the end of the year?
If we were to move the testing window back, then we would not get the results any sooner. So if the testing window moves back, then you would get the results on the same timeline.
It's not moving up.
It's not, the plan is not to move it up, correct?
And then 12 weeks total for scoring?
Yes, that is correct.
And the other paper-based, it was 7 weeks total for scoring?
Yes, that is correct. And so the difference there is the way in which we process the scoring for the two test types. It's just inherently a different process. And so where you see the longer time for administering and scoring, we've lumped together a couple additional categories. And so it's 12 weeks total for that administration and scoring, where we've broken out on the paper-based timeline. So you see the 7 weeks and then 14 weeks total for additional administering and scoring. So it's some like really technical pieces that go into both of those things, but we just wanted to try and show you that when we have the paper-based testing timeline, there's an additional 7 weeks that is specifically geared towards just scoring.
So the bottom bullet where you have 12 weeks for total for administering and scoring, as opposed to 14 weeks for administering and scoring, that's your 10 days.
Yes,
That we're
exactly.
gaining.
Yes, thank you.
Other questions, concerns, Kelly?
About there are some technical things or some pieces that would have to happen for it to be 10 days sooner. What are those things?
Specifically, obviously, if we're talking about moving the window back, then that would change the day in which you get the results back. There's also some stuff that we need to understand. There are psychometrics that go into field testing. And so as we get back the field test results for social studies, that's going to help us understand the timeline in scoring the social studies assessment. And then that will have an impact on our overall timeline here for computer-based versus paper-based. And so it's both like understanding the metrics of the assessment items themselves and making sure that we understand how long the scoring will actually take, and then understanding from you guys your input and from the rest of the field as a whole when you want the window to be, and if that is going to change the day in which you would receive the results.
My only concern with the window, and I talked about this last time, is we have to look at the syllabuses or the requirements of what is within the course, right? Like 3 units of a guidebook, 45 days, right, per guidebook. Considering sometimes we have hurricanes and other storms and things like that, that takes play. So we can't just randomly select a date and say, okay, well, let's have it here. Well, you might not be done with your curriculum yet. And if that's the case, if we want to push it up, then maybe the test covers 85% of the curriculum, right, of standards versus 100%. So those are things I think we need to be very careful about when we're selecting a date, because the backwards mapping to that of when you start your school year and how many days you actually have to get the curriculum done will impact then the kids' ability on the test. You don't want to give them a test where they haven't covered something either. It's not fair to them.
So being that we have a more flexible window, then schools have the opportunity, or districts have the opportunity to adjust for covering the curriculum.
Yeah, we always put math last, so, yeah.
Thank you, Karen.
Is there something available now to get our second graders prepared for computer-based testing? Like, is there like some kind of module or something? I know that there's, but like something specific to get those little kids prepared? Because we know that all of the kids use the technology, but they use it in an informal way, right? They know, and that's what I learned about our parents too. You know, when they're on social media doing all of these things, you know, you would think that they knew certain things, right? But they actually didn't. So it's the same thing with the kids. They know it informally, but they don't know the formal things they need to know to be able to be successful on a test.
That is a great point. So the information that we have now is the module that's available. But I think that if that's something that you're interested in getting resources for, I'm happy to take that back to our team and see what resources are available for students who are in second grade or younger and need to learn these skills.
And Dr. Joseph, the input that I've gotten from the educators I've spoken to is that if we're going to computer-based for third grade, they need to do these specific things, drag and drop, and the placement, because even if they're working on one of our educational platforms, they may not ask for the same type of response. And so they need to be doing that all year before they end up taking the tests like that. Because it is a different mechanic, really, of answering.
And that was the point I was alluding to when I asked about the skills and exposure. And then when you talk about all of the technology that systems were able to get and implement, there are two issues there. One of them is sustainability, because after a period of time, that's going to be out of date. So we got to look at that. And the broadband connectivity, there's a plan, but the plan is a gradual implementation to where especially access in rural areas is going to be taking longer than in other areas.
I think both of those are great points, and we'll take that into consideration as we think about the timeline. Jennifer?
Really in how well they can answer the questions, but in how they answer questions that use online tools. Okay, so that's there, and we're glad to enhance it however we need to, or remind people however we need to, that it is there.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Jennifer. And maybe that could be available even for second graders if we do go to computer-based.
Well, and second graders can certainly access that platform already. And then I also just wanted to remind this body that we actually found that there was only one item out of 63, excuse me, that was slightly harder for students to assess on. And that of the 4 that had a difference at all, 3 of those were actually the paper-based items. And so I hear your concern and agree that we want to make sure that every student has access to the OTT and is able to test the skill itself and learn the skill itself. But I also think it's really important to ground ourselves in that data and remembering that in this mode study, we've seen success in students and actually greater success in the computer-based items than they had in the paper-based items.
Any other comments? Carol?
Like the ACT rollout, when they went computerized, instead of just the online tools where they're actually released questions, instead of just practicing the tools, I think that is helpful when the kids see it in context.
Yes, Devine.
316. Yep.
Dr. Holly?
So I think it's going to be important that we do have those modules, especially for the population with the students with disabilities. I know we've had some difficulty this year with unique accommodations being approved. So I'm kind of thinking as we go through all this, our students are going to need those accommodations, and we're going to need to take a look at, the practice items. I know we have third grade, but the modules for all of our students so that they can do as well as the others, and so we can kind of impact the subgroups.
Dr. Holly? Other comments? Chelsea, do we have any, I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Karen.
Add one additional thing. I think it's going to be more important than ever that we we ensure that we are using Leap 360 and allowing the kids to get their touches through completing those interim assessments, and that will also give them some practice.
Thank you, Karen. Lots of good hints to how they can improve their practice. Any other comments? Chelsea, do we have any cards? Okay. Seeing no cards, we'll move to the next item on the agenda. This is the fastest moving Accountability Council meeting I've ever been at. I know. Thank you, Carol, you're right. So moving to agenda item number 5, Amelia's going to present again, and this is the update about the proposed inclusion of field testing indicators for 3rd through 8th grade in the 23-24 SPS scores. Amelia? Who knew? Okay, we need a motion. Let's go back before we do this one. We do need a motion to receive the report. Carol and Tia, thank you, Tia, and welcome. A second to receive. Thank you. And now we'll move on, and Amelia will give us the update for the field testing indicators for 3rd through 8th grade. Thank you.
I think as we prepare for social studies field testing and consider how we're going to calculate school performance scores for next year, we're really excited that each person on this council comes with their own perspective. And so we are really hoping to get your honest and open feedback on this item specifically to help understand specifically what are some of the guiding principles that we should be considering as a council as we get ready to make this decision and bring policy forward to you and then forward to Bessie to move forward. And so I think from this group, I'm just curious to hear, what data do you think is the most important to consider? Is it individual school outcomes, averages across the state, letter grades? Is there something else that we should be considering as we think about what is the best way for us to calculate school performance scores next year? And if you'll remember, in the last meeting, we brought forth the proposal and had you consider, does it make more sense that we don't include social studies results at all in school performance scores? And so we would just include math, ELA, and science, or is it better to go ahead and double weight science? So it would be math, ELA, and science would count twice, which would be the same weighting as math and ELA currently. And so as we're getting ready to dive further into this discussion, I'm just hoping to hear from the council more. What are some of those things that you consider to be really important guiding principles when we make this policy decision? Or propose this policy to Bessie, excuse me.
This is based off of this year's test, right? When you say 23, 24 performance scores, it's based off of this year's test, though.
It's next year. Next year's scores,
Come out in the fall of 24.
yes. So you will not receive a social studies assessment score for that year because social studies will be field testing. Exactly. We want to make sure that we take the policy as early as possible so that schools have time to prepare whichever way.
Will the interim test, like the leap, oh, sorry. Will the interim, the LEAP 360 be updated with practice tests for kids that mimic, are based off of those standards?
For social studies, yes, we're updating all items.
So the field testing is going to take place in this spring,
Next spring, spring of 2024.
spring of 2024, and the full implementation is going to be the 24-25 school year,
Exactly.
which the letter grade they receive will be in October, November.
Of 20,
25. So
yes.
with the field test, the letter grade's going to be 2024. That's what we're talking about right now. So it's the test given next year when social studies is field tested in the 23-24 year for the outcome of the grade that comes in the fall of 24.
Which is the same process you've used in other implementations?
Are you asking, is this the same, like, field testing process? Yes, exactly. So we've done this before for science, specifically most recently.
And you've had it piloted this year? Are you piloting
No, we are not currently piloting.
next year?
Just field testing across the state next year, correct?
Dr. Joseph?
And the past practice was that that subject was not included in the school performance score? What was the past practice when we did it?
My understanding of the past practice is that we actually double weighted science, is that we didn't include it at,
I thought we picked the highest of the 2 years.
Yes.
that was
Right,
after
that's
we.
what happened, right.
So after we fully implemented and the test was operational, you did choose the highest of 2 years, and we are no longer allowed to do that per federal guidelines. However, specifically today, I'm hoping to gain feedback on what we should do during the year in which we are field testing, where we will have no results. So you won't be able to pick the higher of two because there won't be anything available.
So Amelia, what are the options that the department's looking at? I know double weighting science.
Yes, we could double weight science, or we could not include anything at all for that portion.
Can you go back to your old social studies score and include that? I don't know if anybody wants to do that, though. It's one of the lowest scores.
Y'all trying to,
Okay, let me back up. So I think before we presented the options, a couple things. One, learning lesson to provide better reminder slides from last meeting, apologies. Two, I think we have the options that I have presented are the two that the department feels the strongest about moving forward with. And so let me back up and give those to you again so it makes more sense. What I was hoping to gather here before we shared the options was just what were some of the guiding principles and your beliefs on what we should consider before we make a decision on what we would want to include in policy to propose to Bessie. And so I think if actually it feels like we would like to just discuss the options, I can go ahead and skip forward. I just want to note for everyone that I'm about to skip a couple slides to get to that point.
I just have a clarifying question. Is it only for that 1 year that we're talking about, or for what would be
Correct.
moving forward?
Just the field test year, so spring 2024, which would be the results that would be released in October or the fall of 2024.
Okay, thank you.
So what we've provided on this slide is if we were to double weight science, so if we were to double weight science in the school performance score, how would the simulated results from the 2021-2022 school year look if that were the case? So this isn't including any social studies results. It includes math weighted twice, ELA weighted twice, and science weighted twice. And as you can see here, only 3.5% of schools saw a change, and only 0.35% of those schools saw a negative change in their letter grade.
there were 205 As and one school went down to a B. Is that what you're indicating this with, when you
Exactly.
double the weight of science? But Okay, I'm not going to skip ahead. Okay.
Explain this chart.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, so if a school was an A in 21-22 based on the actual release results and was an A in the simulated results, that's what the 205 represent. So 205 schools were an A in release results and an A on the simulated results and saw no letter grade change. One school saw a letter grade change down to a B. If I was a B in 21-22 and the simulated results showed that I was also a B, there are 392 of those schools. 5 schools saw a letter grade increase to an A. So 358 schools were a C in 21-22 and stayed a C in the simulated results. 13 of them raised to a B, 2 of them lowered to a D. 181 were a D in 21-22, stayed a D in the simulated results. 12 of those schools increased to a C, 1 decreased to an F. And 130 schools stayed an F.
What,
6 increased to a D, excuse me.
What about the 22-23 results? Using those as the latest information.
We don't have those results yet.
I know you don't have them, but if next year is going to be a field testing, you have a better picture, because 21-22 was the year, you know, students were just coming back. 22-23 is I think, a better snapshot of where students actually are, and you can make better predictions.
We could wait to do a simulation, but then the earliest I could bring policy back to this council would be the January meeting of 2024, which would mean that we wouldn't be taking policy to Bessie until March of that year, and would result in us making policy in the spring while students were gearing up to take the field test, and you wouldn't know what your school, how your school performance score would be calculated until March of the year that it's released. And that didn't sit well with us as a department either, because then you wouldn't have enough time to know or predict what your scores would be.
But if you go back to the other chart that you had and you use the data from the individual school outcomes, couldn't you better data and stuff like that and have a better picture of where the schools were going?
Oh, we could have a better picture. I think there are two things. One, that's part of why I wanted to understand what are the guiding principles. And it sounds like to me, we're really focused on what letter grade changes are. And if that's right, then I think that's the thing that we can hold true as we consider what our options are. But the other thing is, the longer we wait to tell schools. And I think in the past, as we have waited to make those kind of decisions as a council, we have seen that schools were very frustrated with that. And so we're trying to be as prepared as humanly possible and give an answer before the school year even starts.
Sure, we would want. Angela?
I think what we do know, Mr. Falk, that traditionally, I think even too, when they were going over a lot of the results and comparing years, that although we had the pandemic, the years weren't too far-fetched off of the data, right? I think it was maybe a few points, like, you know, over, under, right? In math sense, it's not really statistically significant. What I can say from looking at both of these graphs, I 100% would vote for number 2. You know, retaining weight without social studies. I think that gives your schools the benefit of the doubt to be able to, you know, not be as impacted. Like, it looks like schools are more impacted with the science double weighting versus like, if you look at the bottom graph, the schools are not as impacted by something by just retaining weighting without those studies.
Angela, with that being said, why don't we let Amelia go through that second chart so that we can talk about both options?
So if we were to retain the current weighting of school performance scores and not include social studies at all, 206 schools who were in A in 21-22 would stay in A in the simulated results. And then is it helpful if I read it out again or, okay, cool, great, got it. Of the schools who were a B in 21-22, 383 stayed a B in the simulated results, 14 increased to an A. 344 who were a C in 21-22 stayed a C in the simulated results, and 29 increased to a B. 166 schools who received a D stayed a D in the simulated results. 28 schools increased to a C. And 122 schools who were an F in 21-22 stayed an F. 14 schools increased to a D. So overall, there are 85 schools whose results changed, and 7.5% of them saw a change overall, compared to 3.5% of the other chart.
This is based on the current accountability system.
That is correct.
What about the numerical score that's going to go up next year in the various categories? Don't we move up the number for A, B, C, or D?
That is
Does
correct.
that take it into consideration?
I would need to check, but I don't believe that we calculated that with this, since this is based on the 21-22 results currently. That is correct.
Yeah.
That is correct.
Hi. So I don't think the numbers are incorrect. You're comparing apples and apples, and then to throw another variable in here would make this chart even harder to read and understand, because then we would have to convert all of the grades over here on the left to go according to the new scale, and it would become more confusing. This gives you an apples to apples comparison of what this looks like. The other thing that I would add is that you're going to have this one transition here, and if you remember, then the next year it's going to transition again. So stability in terms of overall scores is likely something that you would want. You would not want the scores to inflate in one year when you know that the following year you're going to go down even more. So those are just two things that I would add. But I would not say that these are incorrect. It's comparing apples to apples in terms of the scales.
But exactly. So it's not a different scale, but as Thomas said, we wanted to make sure that this chart was as clear as mud. And so we really didn't want to throw anything else off as we were calculating it.
I think schools would appreciate it if they got the real information, because I understand what you're saying is comparing one scale to the next, but really that's still, the numbers that we're looking here are still not the right numbers that we would get when they do shift the grading scale.
Dr. Joseph, I do think these numbers are the numbers that are reflected in the scale that is right now.
Right now.
And
But not-
unless we convert every one of our numbers now to the new scale, I think what this is showing you is how many schools actually increase because of what we're doing here and how many decrease. It's not really discussing the scale. I know it has ABC, but I mean, we all know the scales are supposed to change in the next 2 years. So your number of A's would change also in that 205 number. It might be, 30 A's and 175 B's. But what we're looking at is whether we double the weight of science or we retain the weight without social studies, does a school's score go up or down? I would suggest you think of it that way, because if you start changing the numbers to the new scale, you are not comparing apples to apples data-wise.
And I think,
That's
I have a summary slide that I think will also help you here when we think about, like, what was the scale score change? And so overall, it was roughly plus or minus 2 points in both simulations. And so even though we saw the schools that changed a letter grade, even though we saw 4 schools decrease overall when we double weighted science, from our position, the department highly recommends that we move forward bringing policy where we double weight science in the 23-24 SPS, and please excuse the typo because that makes this 10 times more confusing. 23-24 SPS, because we saw the least amount of change there for schools overall. And I'm open to your feedback, I think, and open to hear, like, what are some other things that we should be considering? Or is it truly, like, are we really just worried about letter grades themselves? Are we worried about keeping the scores as stable as possible? As Thomas mentioned before, what are some of those things that you're thinking about for the people that you represent as the department prepares to bring you some policy to consider in the next
So,
meeting?
Amelia, for both simulations, it was a plus or minus 2 points.
That's correct.
Eileen?
I know from a teacher's standpoint, knowing that because I do teach science in a middle school setting, which I know is different than elementary, but having something double weighted compared to, it's a lot on your shoulders to, you know what I'm saying? It's just, math, like.
And ELA.
If the math teachers knew that their score was doubled, it would put a lot of pressure. And I know in an elementary setting, it's typically that teacher is teaching more than one thing. And it subconsciously, that teacher is constantly thinking, well, I have to push science because it's double weighted for our school this year.
Thank you, Kylie. Math and ELA are both double weighted, so it would be,
That's what I'm saying, welcome to our.
yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah, that's okay. But, I mean, that is a consideration, that it's, science teachers are teaching and it's double weighted.
I want to just bring this up for the sake of the charter schools. With this year, 23-24, someone could be in their renewal year that year, right? Where the data, counts for that 1 year. And what if they're the school that goes down because of this, and they get shut down? I always want to put that out there. I know there's not a lot of schools in this that have that, would be going down. I do understand that statistically here. But if you're that one school and then you get closed down, it's not a good feeling. Based off of a 1-year rule. Does that make sense?
It does. I also just want to highlight, this is simulated data, and so we're not sure what it will really look like in 23-24, which is, a year from now, a year and a half before we have results. And so while I think this is important for us to ground ourselves in as we make a consideration, I do think that when you look at the lack of overall movement by double weighting science, that still feels like the thing that would hold scores most stable. And it wouldn't be a guarantee to schools that that those 4 schools would definitely go down a letter grade.
And you said the option of keeping the social studies scores, that's not an option. That's right? Is that correct?
Keeping the social story.
Carrying over the social studies scores?
I don't know how the feds would think about that, so I can't say definitively whether that'd be something allowable or not, but I am curious to hear your thoughts on keeping it.
What's
Is that-
absolutely not allowable? Because what was not?
No,
allowable?
I'm not, it's not allowable for us in 25-26 when it's, in 24-25 when it's operational, for us to average, or to pick the higher of the 2. And so this isn't on that list, but I am curious your thoughts in keeping social studies as your previous year score for a current year SPS, if that makes sense. Is that, Or is it just something you're curious about?
We would be basing it off of this year's scores, and where schools don't know, I don't think that's quite fair either.
That is
You
true.
know, it seems like we're making a decision between stability for the most part or inflation, right? I mean, that's what we're looking at, in my opinion.
I think from our perspective, that is how our reaction has been to this data. But obviously, we're bringing it to the council, interested in seeing, is that also how you're reacting to this? Is that how you feel? Are there any other things that we should be considering before we craft the policy?
Have you considered what other states do with social studies since it's not really required by ESSA?
Do you mean how it's weighted in their formulas?
Well, if it's not required, why do they give it?
I think that's a great question. However, I want to stay really focused here because our current policy is to include social studies. And so as we get ready to give feedback and craft the policy, I don't want us to get distracted by a discussion that wouldn't impact field testing, but is a grander topic for ideally a different day.
We had that discussion about 8 years ago.
What would be unfair with using social studies scores for social studies? What would be wrong with that?
If
What's
we
not
were
fair
to
about that?
use the prior year social studies score in 23-24, then you would use this year's social studies results, and we haven't announced that to schools. But also, it would mean that you wouldn't have any control over changing it or seeing any kind of improvement, when I know a lot of schools have done a lot of work around increasing the quality of their social studies instruction and are continuing to do that work. And so I would hate for you guys to have to use a score that is older. Does that make sense?
I guess I'm getting a little confused.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So this is for 2023, 2020, 2024, wait, what year are we talking about now?
We're talking about school year 23,
For next school
24.
year.
Correct.
Right, for next school year. And so we would not want to use the social studies scores
From this current school year,
or from last year because,
because you wouldn't have any control to change them. So you would have had, if you were to use even last year's, you would have had 2 cohorts of students come through, and then we would be basing the score off of students that aren't even in your school anymore.
and I
that
would have control over science being doubled?
you would know about it in the next 2 months, 3 months.
You would know about it in the beginning of
From a
the year.
different, come from a completely different subject. I'm double weighting science to compensate for not having a social studies test.
I think
where
that's
my thing is.
No, that's a great point. I think that's valid. I think that's completely valid. If the council feels like double weighting science feels unfair because we're talking about a different subject, that is a guiding principle that I think we could definitely discuss.
And that's where I sit. It's like, I don't know, it doesn't mean, I'd rather it stay stuck in social studies and deal with whatever than double weight a different subject to compensate for one not being there.
That's helpful. Thank you, Dr. Joseph.
Then the only problem is explaining the score drop the next year with them moving up. And then all of a sudden, you're raising the standard, the scores are moving up, and the test is being included. It's going to be a drop.
That is a potential. That is correct.
But couldn't that happen anyway when they change when the grading scale changes? You're going to deal with that anyway.
Yeah,
That's
but
coming.
Now you're double.
I mean,
Because you're
What would-
raising them artificially and then.
What would
yeah.
happen is like,
well, you know, we've been dealing with that for,
yeah.
what's the difference?
What it would look like is when 23, 24, if we went with option 2, the more inflated option, right? The scale increase would probably level that off, if I had to guess, to where there didn't look like a lot of change overall. The next year, what would happen is you would see a bigger drop, a dip happening the following year, because the scale is going to move up again, right? And you don't have this formula piece in there. You go back to the old formula, which is more like the top one. Does that make sense? So you would have 1 year where it looked like not much of a change. The following year, it would look like a huge drop.
I think Angela's point is that the first option with double science, which does sound a little crazy in some ways, it gives more stability as the grade scale raises 2 years in a row, because if it ends up being arbitrarily inflated 1 year, then the second year, when the scale raises again, if the scores are arbitrarily inflated, it's going to be a bigger drop. Is that accurate, Angela?
I mean, the problem is artificially using one subject to balance another. We all get it.
Yeah.
But our problem is we're supposed to be transparent for parents. So how are they going to understand that, yes, wow, we're an A school, now we're barely a B the next year, and, yeah. It's, I don't know. That's where the stability sounds better, even though you're artificially doubling a subject that's not social studies, but I don't know. I don't know which one is going to be more transparent for parents, and that's my big concern.
That's a good point, Carol, because that is one of our values, is being transparent with parents. I think if science is doubled, and again, I don't know where I am on this, but to Kylie's point, ELA is doubled, math is doubled, science is doubled. That's the message for parents next year while we field test social studies and then go back to them counting one time, if that's the direction we go in. If it's not the direction, then the message to parents is no social studies score because we're field testing. I do think there could be a couple of drops overall because of the scale raising 2 years in a row. So not if you don't have social studies, if you look at the simulations that they've done, that if we don't include it, it inflates our scores a little bit for 1 year. So, and Thomas or Amelia, maybe you all know this, is social studies pretty much a subject that tests the lowest in the state?
Consistently.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So if you don't have it for a year and you inflate those scores, and in the meantime, the grades, the letters grade scale also is inflated, you might be about the same, maybe. Maybe not, but you might be. But the next year when we add social studies back in and the grade scale inflates again or increases again, that could be a really big difference between this coming year and the following year, because we've artificially inflated it by not including social studies. And if social studies continues to be the worst subject tested, that is going to be a drop in scores. That does concern me.
In essence, like, someone in 23, 24, at the end of that could be a C, right? But they're not truly a C in some ways, because they might, because of the scale, technically be a D, right? If they had their normal, if you took and just inserted social studies scores in for them, what they would typically make, they might be a D, but they're a C. Then you do the actual scale again moves, they take tests, now the social studies is in, that school can actually drop to an F, right? And really have not moved too much in their scores, in essence, of where they were, how they performed in 23, 24. Let's just say they performed the same, 23, 24. And then 24, 25, they could be an F, and then it looks, it looks bad publicly to that school, right? Like they didn't do enough, or they just slacked off, or the leadership didn't do what and in essence, they could have just done the same performance, but it just looks different in scores. And that's where I have a large concern, because, I mean, that's the reality of what really could happen.
I'm not concerned about letter grades. I'm concerned about the subject. Double weighting a science to compensate for our social studies just does not sit well with me. Now, however it's going to fall, it's going to fall, because, you know, you're going to have the changes with the grading scale. There's nothing you can do to get out of that. You'll see, it's the same scenario that we've been experiencing since 2012, when, you know, you make the change and you see a dip in adjustments, all that stuff. Here we are again because we are changing a test. So I think we just have to be, well, I don't know, everybody has their own thoughts about how it should go. I sit where I don't think it's fair to double weight one subject to compensate for another. Now, what that looks like, you know, beyond that point, you know, I don't see why keeping, so if you need a placeholder, then let it be social studies, a social studies score some kind of way. Whatever that is, let it, that's what it is.
It's triple math. No.
Gee, Carol. Every math teacher loves you for that comment.
I'm a math teacher, too.
Other thoughts? Where do you all stand on this? We need some input.
There's unintended consequences either
A
direction.
long-term
There
unintended
really
consequence.
are.
Long-term unintended consequences, for sure.
It's,
100%.
I would love to hear from parents, to be honest with you.
I love that idea. I think it's a weighty topic. It's, you know, it would take really some deep explaining with parents.
I guess I feel a lot like Dr. Joseph feels with allowing social studies to maintain itself. What was I think your response, Amelia, was that we would have to get permission from the federal government in order for that social studies grade from this current year to maintain itself or to hold that place for next year?
It would be a part of, it would impact our current ESSA agreement. And so, yes, we would need to discuss that with them to ensure that that would be something allowable under the current laws. Traditionally, my understanding is their stance is carrying forward historical scores is an inaccurate representation of the current performance of a school. But we haven't discussed this specific item with them yet. And so I am uncertain of how they would feel about it.
But so is doubling the science. So is doubling science. It's not a clear picture of
It's
what
not an
kids are
accurate
doing.
representation of
It's
social studies performance. I agree with you. So I think, like, I'm hearing two very definitive camps of hold the scores stable versus, like, what is right and true about making sure that we're representing school performance scores correctly so that science is included in the way that we traditionally, historically, currently value it. So if there are any other, like, thoughts, I'm happy to hear them, any other feedback that you want to give. Or if there's something like burning over the next couple weeks, please reach out, email me, or call me. I'm happy to discuss it further. But if there isn't anything else for today, then I can discuss kind of our next steps and what we have to do as a department and what I'm hoping to do as we engage with you further prior to the May meeting.
One point is, we're talking about social studies grades 3 through 8. When you go 9 through 12, the social studies component they must pass to be able to graduate.
Okay, so as we get ready to gear up for our next meeting, we're going to take all of the feedback and input you have given us, and the input that we got from the previous meeting to start crafting our updates for Bulletin 111. I think obviously we're in a very interesting position where there are two distinct camps, and so I expect that I will reach out to most of you individually to try and get your input on what that policy looks like before we bring it to this group. Those revisions will be brought to that meeting, to the May meeting, and then based on your recommendations, we'll take a final copy of the Bulletin 111 revisions to June Bessie, which will give schools a full calendar year to prepare whichever way we end up deciding.
Can we get a gauge now about where the council is right now? I mean, because, so the options are to what? Not have social studies or double weight science. That's the two options, right?
The two options from our perspective currently, yes. From the department's perspective currently, yes. Obviously, you've also brought forward the potential of carrying a past social studies score forward, but I would not personally recommend that at this time. So I'm trying to say yes, but also I hear you in giving me a third option.
So the department is wanting to double weight science.
We see the most score stability. So if we're talking about score stability, I think from our perspective, that feels like the best as far as making sure performance scores stay the same. But if the guiding principle from your perspective is to make sure that we are not over counting science, then I hear you in that too.
And the other thing that I would say is that we'd like to go to Ed with the multiple options and ask them, can we, because continuing social studies, to your point, would be stable scores, right? So if that's a value, then it checks that box. We just need to find out whether or not that would be permissible, and then we can come back and get a clearer pulse check, knowing all of that and letting you all kind of weigh from an educator and community perspective, like, does it make sense to carry forward year-old scores that schools you can't have an impact on, right? Because the impact already happened in there. So we want to go and get that information from Ed, let folks think about that, and then have a detailed conversation and kind of get the council's formal position on that once we have all that information.
But when we selected the higher of the two for science, those scores were already done, right? That was done. We selected the highest of the two.
And we were,
This one, we just carry over what is already there.
so I think our flag is, after we did that for science, the feds came back and told us that that was absolutely not allowed within the current laws and within their understanding.
In selecting of the higher two.
In selecting of the higher two. And so we just want to be sure that we're extremely cautious as we proceed, because there have been implications in the past that they would potentially withhold our funding if we were to continue down a path of giving schools those kinds of options.
But my point is the higher two of scores that are already set. They were tests already done, you got your score.
Right.
Right, compared to the social studies.
Carrying forward.
Carrying over a score that's already there, nothing you can do.
Right. Their concerns in the past when we have mentioned something similar has been whether or not it is an accurate representation of performance for students at the school at that time. And so if you were to carry forward a score from this year at, for instance, a 6 through 8, then in 2 years, those students, or in 23, 24, those 8th grade students would no longer be students. And so you would be using performance for students who no longer attend the school.
Well, that's what you're doing in the high schools with the graduation rate and the strength of diploma. It's exactly what you do every year. It's a lag behind.
It is a lag behind. I think, like to Dr. Beck's point and to what I've heard from the feds before, this academic indicator.
It's not a lag behind. Well, it is a lag behind, but it's not using the same data multiple times in accountability, which is the cohort grad rate is going to lag behind, but we're not using it multiple times. If the student drops out, we don't count them 2 times in the cohort. We count them just that one time. And this would be using the same assessment results multiple times in accountability, which is one of the things that causes a red flag in terms of using the data. But I feel like this was a really productive and helpful conversation that we can bring back more information on.
Angela?
I feel like because of the long-term implications, like, we won't feel the heaviness of this decision until, honestly, 24, 25, when the drop happens. I know it's a pain, but I feel like we do need to convert these 21, 22 scores to the scale. And I think we need to then convert, get those scores, what it would look like in 23, 24, you know what I mean? And then I think we need to then shift that, oddly enough, we need to look at two scales and then see the implication of what's going to happen in 24, 25. Not changing the performance of the, the kids, just pretending like the school performed the same every single year so that we can see longer term what the impact of this decision is going to make, because that's when we're going to feel it is a couple of years from now, not immediately.
Question. I really believe that stability is the most important goal. I don't think we want to see a surge and then a drop, because neither is accurate. So my question is there a way to maintain stability without double weighting science or using test scores that are not current?
It's a great
We have
question,
another option.
Bridget.
So I'm confusing the issue even more.
No, it's a great question, actually.
We can definitely explore it.
It's got to go somewhere.
The issue is because science and social studies are the lowest in our state as far as performance. That's why the science will stabilize it. If you took it out, math and English would be higher. You would have higher scores because they do, people,
Did you say something about, did I read something about the average? Oh, no, it's okay. Because you're just looking for a placeholder for that year. You're looking for a placeholder for that 1 year, right?
That's correct.
What it is.
This one?
Maybe
So
look
it
at
really-
averages
The average of
of
I'm with it too.
science with
social
previous.
studies, grades over, I don't know.
Could we
of the
remove
state?
science and social studies and just do ELA and math for a couple of years? I don't know,
I don't think that would solve our problem of keeping the scores stable. And since we're just looking for a solution for 1 year. And so I feel like what I'm hearing is, what are some of the other options we can look at? And we're happy to take it back to our team, see if we can run some simulations to determine, is there anything else that would hold letter grades stable? And I'm happy to share that information with you and then engage with you as we get ready to prepare the policy, still having the goal of bringing that back to this May meeting. May 8th. It sure is. It's real tight, but we'll be there. Okay. If there's anything else that comes up, please reach out. I'm happy to discuss this with you and hear your concerns. And otherwise, I pass it back to Dr. Glazer.
Thank you, Amelia. Tough stuff. We appreciate your work there and appreciate you listening to all of us and to everyone who contributed. Please be in touch with Amelia as you process this and think about it in the next week or so. And know we're in a short timeline for her to gather information. Can we get a motion to receive the report?
Motion?
Thank you, Bridget. And a second? Angela seconds. Okay. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. The end of the agenda. It is a new record. Can I get a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Got public comment?
Oh, any public comment? No cards, right? No cards. Thank you. No, thank you. Motion to adjourn, Tia. Second to adjourn. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. See you all in May.
Quick second. We got a quick way that maybe will help.
Must have been the quickest meeting